Though I don't know if any times in human history have been uncomplicated, life right now seems particularly complex. And yet, in the midst of uncertainty and a tense economy, we have an opportunity to create simplicity in our homes and lives. Having agency in our lives to live simply isn't always easy, but today I'm sharing a few ways I practice simple living when things are complicated. If you were to look up the term simple living online, most definitions suggest that living simply requires one to reduce the number of their possessions, renounce technology, live frugally, and retreat from modern life. And though I think that is one way to attain a simple life, I believe that defining simple living in such a way makes simplicity feel unattainable for most people. Rather than renouncing commercialism and consumerism, one way I aim to live simply is by recreating trends and goods at home. So rather than giving my money to a company, I take from them these ideas and implement them into my own life in ways that are simplified for me. And it is time for the first pumpkin spice latte of the year. And I know many people wait all year for certain coffee shops to release their first PSL of the year. And there is nothing wrong with that if that gives you great joy. But by making one at home, I can save money, add in wholesome ingredients, and enjoy my time at home, not in a drive-through line. This recipe is really easy. It is simply 3 tablespoons of pumpkin puree. I add in maple syrup to taste and the regular amount of milk I would use for a latte. Then I brew 2 shots of espresso. You could use a strong coffee if you prefer. Add in a little pumpkin spice to that, and then I froth the milk pumpkin mixture until it is warm through, and you have a beautiful pumpkin spice latte. Of course, even the act of buying an espresso machine or groceries at some level is participating in consumerism. But unless you are willing to completely recede from modern life, consumerism is impossible to escape. I am making a concerted effort to purchase things that will last a lifetime and beyond. And a perfect example of this is cast iron. Cast iron gets a bad rap for being complicated and high maintenance, but it is so simple and low maintenance. Both of my skillets had food stuck to them and they are in need of reseasoning. So to get the stuck food off, I'm simply just boiling a little bit of water in the skillet and then pouring it out. And then I like to take a little wooden spatula and scrape any bits off. And then I use soap and water to clean them. Modern day dish soap is perfectly safe for cast iron. And then once it is nice and dry, I'm taking a little bit of avocado oil, rubbing a thin layer on, and then I just put them on my gas burners and let them get hot until they smoke. And though having fewer items can be helpful, I have found that a simple life also means having items that are timeless and durable. There is a sentiment that simple living and technology cannot coexist. Sure, technology can distract us from the things that matter most. We've all been sucked into the Instagram black hole, but technology can also support simple living. I might not be churning butter by hand, but I do use an electric grain mill. And I might not be cooking over an open fire, but I do use my Instant Pot to make scratch-made meals for my family. And on one hand, I use these technologies to enhance my simple life, but then at the same time, in some ways, I'm scaling back in others. Here, I am making a simple DIY cleaner for the kitchen that I've been using now for over a year, and it's great. So it is simply just white vinegar, and I fill my container about a third of the way up, and water, and that is it. I like to believe that no amount of technology can replace our humanness, but the technology I choose to engage with supports the life I hope to curate and cultivate in my home. There isn't much I can do about the rest of the world, but I can at least control what is happening at home. And simple living in many ways is really about control. How can we control our circumstances to create a life we feel good about? So for me, simple living isn't so much about renouncing the world and getting rid of technology. Instead, it is about positively taking control of it within my home. In case you are wondering what I'm making here, I am making a fall quesadilla. So this is a tortilla with some homemade apple butter, a little bit of smoked Gouda, and some smoked pork that we had frozen and thawed recently. And I just toasted it up in a little bit of butter in a cast iron skillet like you would any other quesadilla. And this was so good. And in the spirit of simple living, it was also so simple and easy to make. Self-sufficiency, or the ability to take care of things without external assistance, is a pretty big part of simple living. And this in recent years has gotten really wrapped up with things like prepping. And I am not a prepper, but I do practice self-sufficiency when it comes to running my home, at least at some level. I bake all of my family's bread from scratch. I preserve as much of our favorite food as I can. And though my garden was a mess this year, I try to grow as much of our food as we can. This isn't to prepare, but rather it's because I have found the benefits of self-sufficiency and simple living are exponential. When I make sourdough, for example, I save money when buying yeast, but by making bread from scratch, I'm serving more nutritious food. And then we feel better because we're eating healthier and I'm enjoying learning new skills. So by one small act of self-sufficiency and simple living in baking bread, we enjoy growing benefits. There is a common misconception that simple and easy are one and the same, but just because something is simple doesn't mean it's easy. It's just uncomplicated. And that's one of the things I value the most when it comes to cultivating a simple lifestyle. It's not complicated. It does sometimes, though, come with a little more work. For instance, I try to keep a well-stocked pantry where I have everything I need to make just about anything I want to make, but I am out of breadcrumbs and I make all of my breadcrumbs from scratch. To do this, over a course of a few months, I collect and freeze all the bread that we do not get through in time. So anything that's going stale, any extra bread that I had to make for my blog, all goes in the freezer. And when I have enough for a big batch, I simply just thaw it, cube it up, and then first I run it through a food processor. I think this is pretty critical to really gain that fine texture of breadcrumbs. You'll see in a minute, I do blend them again later, but I found if you just put them in the food processor first, the end result is much better. So run them in the food processor and then I bake them at 300 degrees for as long as they need to be in there. So I check them every 10 to 15 minutes until they are completely toasted and dry. Then I let them come to room temperature and then I blend them and turn them into a really nice fine powder like store-bought breadcrumbs. For sure, this is more time consuming than running into the store and buying breadcrumbs, but it costs pennies to make these. They taste way better, and there's such a deep sense of satisfaction when you make these pantry essentials from scratch. If you are like me and you're living in the middle of the suburbs, or if you're living some lifestyle where finding this sense of simple living feels complicated, the place I encourage you to start is in the kitchen. And specifically, I encourage you to start with replacing one store-bought meal or restaurant meal with an equivalent scratch-made meal. And once you've dialed in that recipe to your liking, memorize it. Get it so seared into your brain that you can make it with your eyes closed. Because when you know that recipe like the back of your hand, it can evolve, especially when you are in a pinch. So one of the things I make the most is a homemade cheeseburger helper. And I went to get my cheddar cheese out of the fridge and it was all moldy. So I had to pitch it and completely pivot the plan. But rather than a complete overhaul, I just made a different version of that recipe. For this recipe, I am just using what I have, which is some lacto-fermented red onions that I chopped up, and then I threw in some ground beef. And while that browned, I added in some spices, a little bit of chili powder, some garlic powder, and I think a little bit of paprika too. Normally, I would use the tomato base for this, but I didn't want to use tomatoes since I didn't have cheddar cheese. So instead, I threw in some shredded zucchini that I preserved from last summer. And then I added in about 2.5 cups of noodles and 4 cups of beef broth. So this is really similar to my regular homemade cheeseburger helper, but I'm just switching out some of the ingredients. But because I know it by heart, I don't even have to think about it. Once the noodles were cooked, I added in just a little bit of ketchup, a splash of heavy cream, and some shredded smoked Gouda. And I know it seems like we are just talking about homemade hamburger helper, but what we are really talking about is creating food we love without caving into consumer demands, using the tools and skills at our disposal, and being able to make the most of every moment. And in a world that is so fraught, what a gift it is to have such autonomy and simplicity in our homes.